Welcome everyone, this is On Just Restart, and this time we're theorizing on how Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity could be linking to the sequel to Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Now, we were actually sort of talking about this during the podcast a few days ago, and I don't want to take full credit for this theory. Brandon from WhataboutNintendo also had a part in this theory as well. But if this theory is true, I think it would make a lot of sense, and it could very well link Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild 2. Now, before we jump into things, I want to talk about my social media. There is a Twitter page, a Discord community, a Patron page, and a Twitch channel. So if you're interested in any of that, check it all out. It's linked in the description below. And of course, if you like what you're seeing here, also subscribe. Now, before I get into specifically what the theory is, I first want to talk about why I strongly believe Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity will be teasing to some extent the sequel to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. So the big reason why I think this is going to be happening is because, well, Breath of the Wild 2 is probably coming out next year. There was a lot of speculation that it could be coming out this year, but that's not happening. Next year seems like a shoo-in for that to be the case. Next year is also the 35th anniversary for Zelda. This February is actually when the anniversary will be happening. So you gotta think Nintendo has some big major plans for Zelda. Not to mention, we saw some trademarks made last year for Mario, a whole bunch of merchandising and such, and this year, we're seeing all of that merchandising and such. It's for Mario's 35th anniversary. We've seen something similar for Zelda. It's all sort of supporting the idea of a big Zelda celebration next year for its 35th anniversary, and The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild 2 definitely is going to be a key piece to that celebration, I think. But here's the other element to all of this. This year, we're getting Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity. That's the big holiday game for Nintendo this year. And we know that the Zelda team is working closely with Koei Tecmo on this game. We even got, with the initial announcement, AJ Numa talking about this game, saying we'll have to wait a little bit longer for Breath of the Wild 2, but they wanted to give us something for us Zelda fans, and it's a prequel story for Breath of the Wild. So it's all about Breath of the Wild here, it's talking about Breath of the Wild. So considering that fact alone, that this is a prequel story for Breath of the Wild, and the Zelda team is working so closely on this project, we're going to be getting more details and context for the story of Breath of the Wild, and that alone is going to paint a different picture for us for Breath of the Wild 2, I think. But I think it goes deeper than that. As I said, I do believe there's going to be some strong Zelda 35th anniversary celebrations going into next year. Breath of the Wild 2 is arguably, or maybe not even arguably, it is pretty much indisputably the biggest game Nintendo has in development right now, save for maybe Metroid Prime 4. It's a big deal. And I would say it's really likely that Nintendo's going to want to use Age of Calamity to market Breath of the Wild. I mean, they already are doing that. We're seeing more and more cutscenes with Link and Zelda and such. We're seeing that Breath of the Wild quality style of footage in all these trailers for Age of Calamity. That gets all of us Breath of the Wild fans very excited. But of course, the other big element to this is that it's all a lead up to Breath of the Wild 2. So I think because of all of that, they're going to want to really create a lot of conversation, a lot of excitement for Age of Calamity, because it is the big holiday game for Nintendo fans this year. And a lot of Breath of the Wild fans are going to be playing it. And with Breath of the Wild 2 and the anniversary coming next year, I think they're definitely going to want something that sort of points us in that direction, that sort of gets us excited thinking about more once we beat Age of Calamity. So in my opinion, it makes a lot of sense for there to be some sort of specific teaser for Breath of the Wild 2 in this game. Is it going to be some sort of cutscene or teaser for Breath of the Wild 2 in the game? No, that's not what I'm specifically thinking. Now, maybe we see something at the Game Awards where they tie in Age of Calamity to Breath of the Wild 2. That's definitely a possibility. But what I'm thinking is that within the actual context of the game, we will learn more about the story of Breath of the Wild that will paint a different picture for what's going to be happening in Breath of the Wild 2, and by the time we beat Age of Calamity, based off the theory that I have for this video, that's going to be pretty clear. So now on to the actual theory. What's going on here? What do I think is actually going down with Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity? Well, last week, we talked about how this mini Guardian is jumping through time, and because it's jumping through time, that now sort of changes things significantly, because time travel is not something new to Legend of Zelda, but it's been used in different ways in the past. With Ocarina of Time, because there is time travel, that actually created 3 different timeline splits, meaning 3 different continuities for The Legend of Zelda where different things would be happening. So because of that, there's a possibility that with this mini Guardian jumping back in time, it could mean there could be different continuities with Breath of the Wild. That is a possibility, and because of that, there's now some uncertainty with where they'll be going with the story, and we don't know if things are going to end exactly as we thought they would, the way things are sort of end up in Breath of the Wild. But the other way Nintendo and the Zelda team have used time is with Skyward Sword. In Skyward Sword, there was time travel, but it was all part of one single continuity. It didn't change things, it was all a part of the destiny, or what actually was going to be the events that would transpire. So what may actually end up happening, instead of the Guardian going back in time to change the future, while that may be what it's trying to do, what it's actually going to end up doing is simply fulfilling what would have already happened. Its actual actions will lead to the future it's trying to stop, a kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's also a possibility here. And on the podcast earlier this week when I was talking about with Brandon, we sort of came to the conclusion that even though it's possible that maybe there'll be a different ending to Age of Calamity than what we see in Breath of the Wild, it makes more sense to think that they would not take away from the continuity of Breath of the Wild and simply create more context for this, because the whole point of Age of Calamity is to be a prequel for that story. So we'll simply see more of what happened before the events of Breath of the Wild. So given that, I feel like it's still unlikely that this mini Guardian going back in time is going to change basically what happens in Breath of the Wild, creating a future where the champions survive. I don't think that's super likely. So then, if that's really the case, does that mean the mini Guardian fails, and that it doesn't change the future as it attempts to do? That may be the case, but there's another possibility here. What if the mini Guardian does change the future, but the future that it changes is not the one we see in Breath of the Wild, and actually it succeeds, and the future we get is the better future that we see in Breath of the Wild? Which may be kind of weird to consider, because the world of Breath of the Wild is a post-apocalyptic world. The champions died, civilizations have been destroyed, Link has fallen, it's not a great future. But what if there was a worse future? That's what I think might be a possibility, and that's how I think Age of Calamity could be linking to Breath of the Wild 2. So let me explain this further. We know in Breath of the Wild 2 that Ganondorf is resurrecting. Well, I say we know. We don't know, but it seems really likely. The corpse we see coming to life in Breath of the Wild 2 is very likely Ganondorf. It has a scar in his chest, it has the red hair, the Gerudo clothing, the yellow jewel. Very likely Ganondorf. What if the future that the mini Guardian stops is actually a future where Ganondorf is fully resurrected before the events of Breath of the Wild? What if the Age of Calamity, the Calamity War, is actually this big effort to finally resurrect Ganondorf and to fully take over? What if that's what was meant to happen? Now, based off the scenes we've seen from the Age of Calamity demo, what we see with the future doesn't seem to specifically depict Ganondorf resurrecting at that time, so it's hard to say for sure. But perhaps as we play through Age of Calamity, we will get a better understanding of the kind of future the mini Guardian was trying to change. And I haven't even brought up the ominous figure we've been seeing in some of the Age of Calamity trailers. There's this character that holds like this magical orb thing that almost looks like a corrupted ancient core, but it also is cloaked and has some sort of Gerudo clothing and long hair and pale skin. The character to me reminds me a lot of Aghanim or Vati or Zant. It seems to be some sort of worshipper of Ganon or Ganondorf. And like those previous characters, or even like Girahim, their big goal was to resurrect the Demon King. What if the entire purpose of this Calamity War, as I said earlier, is to resurrect the Demon King Ganondorf? And maybe this ominous figure we've seen in the trailers is playing a big role with that. If it is a character like Zant or Vati or Aghanim, he may be trying to resurrect not just Ganon, but Ganondorf. And maybe if things go the way they actually have planned, it goes all the way, and it's not just this malice force, this Calamity Ganon that we see that's like a force of nature terrorizing Hyrule, but actually, it's Ganondorf in his humanoid form taking over and fully ruling the world with no chance at recovery. What if that's the future the mini guardian was trying to stop? I honestly do think that this might be the case, but admittedly, I don't really have that much more evidence beyond what I've already presented. The only other thing I feel like is worth bringing up is that looking at the final cutscenes for the Age of Calamity demo, when they actually get the Guardian and they assess some of its information, its data, they take a look at some photos it had taken or that it had in its database, and they make sure to point out that they don't get all the information, that there's still more to analyze and figure out about what's actually happened in the future. From what we've seen so far, it has not been made clear if Ganondorf himself has been resurrected or if it's just Calamity Ganon the way we see it in Breath of the Wild. But it is just the beginning of the game, and they are suggesting that there is more to find out about the future. So there's something there that is being implied by the story that there's more of, a mystery. And it wouldn't be something that we would want to learn about in the beginning. They wouldn't tell us that in the beginning if Ganondorf was being resurrected at that time. That's a big plot point, something that we'll probably find out if it's actually the case later on to the story. And really, the biggest reason why I think this theory sort of holds up, even though I'm sure some of you guys may point to some holes, and by all means do so in the comments, is that it would explain why the mini guardian is going back in time, because I don't think it makes sense for there to be a mini guardian that goes back in time to change the future if that future is different from what we get in Breath of the Wild. I think whatever we see in Age of Calamity, it has to continue into Breath of the Wild, because Age of Calamity is supposed to be an actual prequel to Breath of the Wild. So what I think makes more sense is that it's actually changing a future that hasn't happened, that we don't actually get to see in Breath of the Wild, that would actually be worse. But the only reason that would make sense, I think, is because that future would be something we deal with later on in the Zelda series, Breath of the Wild 2. And because Age of Calamity is so far into this year as a holiday game, Breath of the Wild 2 and the anniversary next year, it really does make sense for Nintendo to use Age of Calamity to sort of tease and market Breath of the Wild 2, and I think this would be the perfect way to do it. And on top of that, all of this would also help to make more sense of this presence of this ominous figure in the trailers as well. It would add up, this puzzle between the mini guardian and the ominous figure, and this apparent need for a tease for Breath of the Wild 2, I think. I think all those things kind of come together with this theory, this idea that the mini guardian is actually changing a future where the war of the Age of Calamity actually is a war to resurrect Ganondorf, and it stops that. And really, what ends up happening is that we get a better future where Ganondorf is not fully resurrected, and there's still hope at the end, and we do see Link eventually come back, resurrected in the Shrine of Resurrection to save Zelda and Hyrule, ultimately so they can finally take down Ganondorf in the sequel to Breath of the Wild. That's the theory, but what do you guys think? Do you guys think it's possible? Do you think it's likely? Do you have other ideas? Let me know in the comments below. Anyways, everyone, this is On Just Restart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care.